Hello everyone, this is AlezierChess here to help you to realize your potential. And today we're going to be looking at two games. We're going to look at Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann from the FTX Crypto Cup, a rapid game that was played in 2022 before the Sinkfield Cup incident. And we're going to be looking at this game. It takes place in a Vassalimo Sicilian, which I plan on doing a number of videos coming up in both the Vassalimo and the Moscow variation games from the top players of today. And we're also going to be looking at a game that took place in 1931 by Vera Menchik versus Jose Raul Capablanca. And she was one of the top women players, a multiple-time women's world champion, and a student of Giza Maraxi. And Capablanca was one of the greatest players of all time, one of the greatest endgame players in particular. And that game took place in 1931. And Menchik was very, very strong. She beat players like Aaron Nzowitz and Alexander Alekhine, but she never managed to beat Capablanca. In fact, Capablanca beat her 9-0. Oh, she also beat Max Hervé, who was world champion after Alexander Alekhine. Now, we're going to be looking at these two games together, starting with the Menchik game, because we're going to see how she got her pieces stuck in mud with the constellation of having a pawn on e5, a knight on f3, and a bishop on g3. And we're going to see also how the same thing happens to Carlsen, despite it being in a different opening and almost 100 years later. So let's not get our pieces stuck in mud, guys. We're going to open with the Menchik game and pawn to d4 here, knight f6. We have a Kali system versus a Queen's Indian system. Here after knight to e5, Copper plays the move d6, which we have the knight swap, but here we also have the bishop swap from Menchik, which was not a great idea because, as we're going to see, she's moving these pieces multiple times in the opening. She moved the knight to f3 and e5, moved the bishop to d3 and now to b5. And here, due to the loss of time, Capablanca is already fully developed. Here, taking on the queen side was d takes c5, d takes, also favors Capa. But here, after pawn to e4, rook ad8, Menchik really needs to get out her dark squared bishop and connect her rooks. Meanwhile, Capablanca is already ready to double up on the d file. Now there's a threat of knight takes c6, knight takes c3, which threatens the queen with check and also hits the rook. So we have bishop to d2, pawn to b5 with further expansion, king f1, bringing the king closer because the endgame is going to ensue. And now, after the rooks swap off, we have queen to e4 from Capablanca, which now attacks the bishop on f4. It drops back to g3. And now, after the queen trade, knight a4, you can't play pawn to b3 due to knight takes c3 check and taking the pawn on a2. So after king to d2, knight takes b2, Menchik is just simply down a clean pawn. Copper puts all of his pawns on right squares, brings the king to the center, continues to put his pawns on right squares. And here, after taking with the king, has an outside past a pawn. Menchik tries to run back to get into the square of the pawn, but after bishop c5 check, here the pieces come off and Menchik resigned. You can't stop the a pawn. You're also going to lose the pawn on c3 and all of your kingside pawns and get mated. But here, this important thing to note as to why I'm showing this game is how having these pieces in this formation, the bishop and the knight are stuck. They can't really improve, as well as the fact that it's a big waste of time because now in order to, say, free the bishop, you have to bring it to f4 and bring it out. and you would also have to bring the knight around and just leave the pawn there under defended in certain cases. And so you have to watch when it comes to overextending this e5 pawn if you don't have an attack against the enemy king. Now we're going to take a look at our main course with Carlsen versus Niemann, who I'm sure need no introduction. We have pawn to e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, the Vassalimo, pawn to g6, one of the main lines, to bring the bishop to the long diagonal to control the center, castles, bishop g7, rook e1, knight f6, e5, knight to d5, knight to c3, and now knight to c7. This move drops the knight back so that it can control the e6 square and occupy it later potentially, and also create a blockade so that white cannot sacrifice the pawn by going to the e6 square. So now after bishop takes knight, we take away from the center in order to open up the c8 bishop. Now we have knight e4 from Carlsen, b6 to defend the pawn, and knight to f6. Now, knight to f6 is designed to stop black from castling. We have king to f8, knight back to e4 from Carlsen, because the knight is now genuinely attacked. We're going to go back and see why it couldn't be attacked in our analysis after we cover the main game. Bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3. We have pawn to d3, and now we have knight to e6. Now this knight is potentially threatening to jump into d4, so we have knight eg5 from Carlsen to swap it off. And here Niemann swaps, which gains a tempo. Carlsen develops his bishop, and now Niemann places the queen on d5. Now the queen on d5 with the bishop on g4 threatened to crack Carlsen's pawn structure after taking and potentially even swapping queens. So here we have rook to e4 to create interference so that the queen on d5 cannot see the f3 square. And now after bishop to f5, Carlsen plays the move c4. This move is inaccurate, as we're going to see in our analysis, because this move creates problems for Carlsen's structure. The d3 pawn is now backward. After queen to e6, we have rook to e3 because the rook was hanging. And rook to e3 is possibly not the best, but we have h6 here now gaining a tempo, hitting the bishop. And now after bishop to f4, g5. And now after bishop g3, we see the same problem as in the Menchik Capablanca game, which is that these two pieces are stuck behind this pawn. They would be much better off if this pawn was off of the board, but Carlsen never takes any opportunity to sacrifice it, which we're going to see in our analysis that he should have after we again show this main game. We have rook to d8, which puts pressure on the backward pawn. According to the engine, Niemann could have also went for king to g8, but I don't like that plan as much. I actually much prefer Niemann's plan, but we're going to show that at the end of the game. Rook to d8 puts pressure on this backward pawn immediately and holds this d4 square so that Carlsen can't play d4 and bring his knight into the center after a capture. We have pawn to h3, and now king to g8, getting ready to bring the king to h7 in order to connect the rooks. We have pawn to a3 from Carlsen. This move is the start of a bad plan. It would have been better to play queen e2, which we'll have a look at. a3, king h7, pawn to b4, rook d7 preparing to double. And now after captures, Niemann's structure looks raggedy on the queen side, but the backward d pawn and the pawn on e5 blocking Carlsen's 2 pieces more than make up for it. We have queen to b3 getting out of the pin, the double up, and now rook d1 to defend the d3 pawn. And after queen to g6, now we have 4 attackers on this pawn. So Carlsen played the move knight e1. It would have been better to play either e6 or queen to a4 instead of knight to e1, but under the circumstances, one could hardly blame him for missing queen a4, but he should have definitely played e6. So this way he could get a counterattack on the rook, but it's a difficult move to have to make, and it's also not a great one. But at least it could have freed its pieces, potentially. But knight e1 is just a sad move to have to play, because now all of your pieces are passive. Meanwhile, all of your opponent's pieces are active, staring at your pawns, and there's nothing that you can do about it. So after pawn to h5, the knight comes back to f3 to at least put pressure on g5 if we have a bunch of trades on d3. But now after h4, the bishop has to go back to h2, and now we have the move e6. This move is the icing on the cake, because now e5 can never move, and here Niemann is just going to continue to improve all of his pieces. After queen to c3, we have bishop to f8, knight back to e1, because again, there's not much that Carlsen can do. He's basically in Zugzwang because he can't improve his position. He has to wait for Niemann to attack. Niemann plays g4, and after h takes, we have bishop takes, hitting the rook on d1. And after pawn to f3, we have bishop back to f5. And you can't play g4 trying to attack Niemann's bishop due to en passant, and your own bishop gets trapped on h2. So here, Carlsen plays pawn to f4, opening up the third rank to give the rook some space. We have bishop to h6, jumping on this pawn right away, also opening up the g file for the black rook if needed. And we have queen to a5 from Carlsen, who goes pawn hunting on the queen side due to not having much to do in this game. Queen to g4 hits the rook on d1. Rook f3 creates interference, and now we have the beautiful bishop to e4, which attacks the rook on f3 and cannot be captured due to the pin, because the rook on d7 would take the rook on d1. So we have queen takes c5, grabbing a pawn for our troubles. Bishop takes the exchange, knight takes, and pawn to h3 with a direct mating threat if queen takes g2. So queen f2 was played, dropping back and defending. Rook takes d3, rook takes, and rook takes d3. We have knight back to e1 again for the millionth time. And now rook takes a3. This move is not even to take the pawn, but to get away from the white queen and threaten rook to a1, which would threaten to pop the knight, and then you would get mated on g2. So here, queen b2 was played, attacking the rook and covering the a1 square, but now Niemann plays rook to e3 and Bob's your uncle, because the knight on e1 is under attack, and after queen to f2, rook takes knight, queen takes rook, we would have queen takes g2 mate. So here, Carlsen played king f2 and resigned after bishop takes f4, because now after bishop takes bishop, queen takes, you can't go back to g1 because rook takes knight is mate, so you have to cover with the knight. And now after rook takes knight, check, you take back, but you open up the second rank for queen h2, skewering the king and queen. So after king to f1, queen takes queen would win the game for Niemann. So what did you guys think of this game? What did you think of the Menchik Capablanca game? And how these pieces, the pawn on e5, knight on f3, and bishop on g3, how the bishop and the knight get held up by this pawn on e5. And write your comments, questions, suggestions in the comments below. Also, like and share if you enjoyed the game. Thank you guys for watching. And for those who want to stick around so that we can go through our analysis, we're going to start with Carlsen's 16th move. Now, in the game, c4 was played, but it was possible here to play rook to e1. And after bishop g4, we could have had a repetition of moves, which would have ended the game in a draw. Also, after bishop to f5, we could have had rook to a4. And now after bishop takes on e5, knight takes, queen takes, bishop h6, here king to e8 would need to be played, because if we go back to g8, this rook is not going to get out anytime soon and we need him. So after king to e8, h4, which prevents g5, was the idea of trapping the bishop on h6. We could have rook to g8 anyway, and after queen to f3, hitting the pawn on c6, which threatens to take the rook on a8 on the subsequent turn, queen to d5 blocking that, and after queen e3, pawn to f6, rook to e1, pawn to e5, pawn to f4, king to d7, and after f takes e5, rook g e8, the game is equal, and the engine actually slightly prefers black at about 0.2 in black's favor if you let it run. Also, in this game, we're going to look at our notation here. It was also possible that on move 19, Niemann played rook to d8, which I really like, but the engine also suggests king to g8 here, and after pawn to h3, king to h7, queen e2, rook h d8. Here we could have a plan of playing on the queen side, but I like Niemann's move better because it was just way more aggressive to go after Carlsen's king, and as Simon Williams would say, checkmate ends the game. So rook h d8, rook d1, king back to g8, bishop h2, pawn to b5, and here black is threatened to open up the queen side, b3, a5, knight d2. This would at least get rid of your knight after knight to e4, which would reduce your problems, because in the game, Carlsen was actually never able to do much with this knight. And it was because he didn't defend his pawns with queen to e2. Also, he didn't really need to make the backward d pawn, but he wanted the win. And if he had played rook e1, rook e4 repeatedly, he would have only drawn. And he's playing against someone that was 200 points lower rated at the time. So a4, g4, bishop g6, knight e4, bishop takes. D takes would be horrible due to the double pawns, and rook d4 creating a wedge in the position. So rook takes bishop, a takes, rook a3, and here black would only have a small advantage. On move 21, we had a3, but we could have had queen to e2, and after queen g6, e6, f6 is a possibility. But if f6, bishop c7, rook c8, bishop back to h2, which gained a tempo by kicking the rook off of the d file. And now g4 is a threat, which would win the bishop on f5. h5 would have to be played, and according to the engine, this is equal. Also, on move 26, Carlsen could have played, instead of knight e1, e6, and after bishop takes, knight to e5, bishop takes, here Niemann could play h5, and the game would go on here, but a sample line could go bishop to a1, and after h4, f3, bishop to f5, and if queen c3, f6, queen a5, e5, queen takes c5, bishop takes d3, queen takes c6, queen f7, covering the d7 rook. So this way you can move the bishop on d3, c5, rook d5, and this position is equal, but it also requires some care from both sides. I manually inputted king to h2 just to see what would happen, and black would get a winning position here due to bishop to b5, because the rook is on d5 and not d7. White can't trade and threaten the queen on f7 and then take the bishop on b5, which is hanging. So after rook takes, you're forced to sacrifice the queen, and it turns out here you don't have enough for the queen. Because of g4, sacrificing the breakthrough, if f takes queen a2, just wins the game on the spot due to the mate threat, as well as attacking the bishop on a1. And if h takes, we have queen f4 check, and we can sacrifice the h pawn. And if the bishop tries to come back in the game, it doesn't work due to bishop to b5, and both the rooks are hit. So after c6, we could take, and we could sacrifice the e pawn to hold the c7 square, and also to break up the pawn structure around the white king. And after rook to d7 check, king g6, because we need to move to a light square, king h6 would put the king on the dark square, so that's unnecessary. Also, going to the back rank would run into c7 and c8 queen, or c7 rook d8 check and then c8 queen. But now after c7, pawn takes on f3, promotion, check, check, and promotion was mate. So here, that was just a sample line. Again, the move 36 king to h2 was not necessary to be played, but e6 was a way that Carlsen could have attempted to survive. Also, queen to a4, e6, queen takes c6, bishop to f8, a4, king g7, knight e1, h5, f3, king h7, bishop f2, g4, takes, and rook to g3 is also playable. But here black is doing great because of bishop to h6. And after bishop to e3, if we swapped out, we're going to take the rook on d1. It's also possible, instead of rook to g3, to attempt rook to d2, but that runs into bishop h6, and here you have to play rook de2 and just give up in exchange. But here you shouldn't take if you were playing black. You should play bishop to g5, and after rook f3, you can take and give up the light squared bishop instead of giving up your dark squared bishop. And after queen takes, black is just clearly better, although there's still work to be done in this position. On move 28, Carlsen could have also played, instead of tucking the bishop, he could have went for e6, rolling the dice, and on bishop takes, bishop to e5, here f6 would not be good for Niemann due to bishop takes, and if you take with the pawn or the bishop, rook's going to take the bishop, but you would have to take with the bishop because taking with the queen doesn't work due to rook takes e6, and white's much better. And if queen takes rook, then white is completely winning after knight takes the pawn, was a fork to the king and the queen. But here, after bishop h2 is in the game, after Niemann plays e6, there's just no way for Carlsen to free his pieces anymore, and Niemann wins without much trouble. There's really nothing at this point that Carlsen can do to try to get back in the game. But thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed my analysis. There's also a number of other lines here, but I don't think that any of them are that great enough to show. But here, Carlsen never sacrificed a pawn. He got his pieces stuck in mud. Also, something that's very important to take away from this game and the analysis is that in the Vassalimo, if you can't castle, it's not a big deal. You have to get used to playing with your king toward the center, whether you have to do a king walk to f8, g8, and h7, or even back to e8 and hanging out in the queenside, as in the line I showed with the king being on d7 in order to connect the rooks. So you have to play this pretty furiously with black, and don't be afraid of the Vassalimo. It doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. I hope you guys enjoyed the game. I'm going to have a lot more Vassalimo games and Moscow variation games for us 2d6 players in the Sicilian coming up on the channel soon. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great day. Get better every day, and peace.